In this part of the video, we're going to be going over civilians and how they suffered during World War II. In a word, civilian life was bad. It was really bad. It was horrific. In another word, horrific. One of the great horrible constants of both military and civilian life in World War II was continual bombing, ranging from high explosives and incendiaries to V-1 rockets and, of course, the atomic bomb. On a much greater scale than the Great War, World War One, cities and civilians were targets, and this is one of the horrific things about World War Two. The aims of these bombings were to destroy infrastructure and to terrorize people. All right. So this was to destroy infrastructure and terrorize the populace. So these bombings included cities like Shanghai, Warsaw in Poland, Dresden. Dresden happened in as the war was ending, and in the Dresden bombings, this was Dresden is a city in Germany. It was bombed by the Allies, and in this bombing, 135,000 Germans were killed, and these Germans were in shelters. They were sheltering from the Allies. They were civilians. They were not military targets. So bombing was done by the Axis powers a lot, but it was also done by the Allies. And a lot of people see Dresden as a revenge for what happened in London with the Blitz, where 40,000 civilians were killed. Tokyo, 100,000 civilians were killed with bombings that resulted in fire bombs. We'll talk about what I mean by that in class. And then, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right. So with the occupation by the Axis powers, different 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 things could happen. So there were examples of, for example, regimes that collaborated, and there were regimes that went against these things. So there were independent states like Thailand and Denmark that had alliances. There were puppet states like Manchukuo and Vichy France, and then there were places that were militarily administrated like Indochina and Poland. A lot of people within these societies were enslaved, and this got back in German for the Germans. This was the idea of living space, and the fact that these Slavic people, both in Poland and in Russia, like didn't deserve to live. They were social in a social Darwinism sense. They were below Germans, and so like any place that was there should be Germans because the Germans would quote unquote like use that space more like better. They deserve to be there more. And then also in for women there was a special terror of, and this like by the way occurred all over the place, but the Japanese had a special um, regulation for it, or like special areas for this. But women were raped systematically by invading armies, and in the Japanese areas, these women were called comfort women. And these women would typically see within combat zones. They were living in combat zones. They were being raped by 20 to 30 men per day. And if it was seen that they were infected by a venereal disease, they were killed. Um, Also, once these Axis powers were defeated, a lot of these women were ostracized by their own people, and a lot of them too, if they weren't ostracized, they were killed by the. This happened within both in the German occupied territory and the Japanese occupied territory, but they were killed to hide war crimes. So there were people who resisted this as well, but a lot of times that really wasn't an option, or resistance had to be like very, very covert. Resistance included intelligence gathering and protecting refugees, symbolic gestures like hanging a sign of resistance in your house, or having um, having like literature or things that you ate. But whenever you did those things, the Japanese and the Germans both used collective punishment. So, for example, if I resisted, my entire class would be punished. And of course, these governments are using a lot of propaganda to instill this sense of fighting within their people. And also they're also using command economies. Women took part um, in the war. This is an example of propaganda with waves. And more so than in other wars, women were part of the fighting too. Okay, so getting more into the horrors of war, with the possible exception of the rape of Nanjing, the worst example of the savagery in World War II is definitely the Holocaust. Anti Semitism has a super long history. Hitler did not invent this by any in any like by any scope, um, and it became one of the foundations of Hitler's philosophy. So, oops. All right. So again, like I've said before, there are many, many resources on the Holocaust. We're going to be looking at this in class as well. So this is just going to be a very brief overview of the facts of things, and very broad, painting with a very broad brush. So with Hitler, the mistrust of Jews took on an all-encompassing racial hatred that really bordered on madness. The persecution of Jews by Hitler dated back to the early days of his reign with the Nuremberg laws of 1935. Um, which there we go. Oh, which made being Jewish a genetic thing, a genetic trait through the mother. So it wasn't just that you were religiously practicing Judaism as a religion, but it was also that your family was Jewish. And this is when you start to see people being identified, and also Jews being more so than they were before, excluded from certain occupations. Also, Kristallnacht in 1938 terrorized Jewish businesses, synagogues, and also led to the deaths of some Jews. And this was carried out by the state. The onset of war only increased Hitler's paranoia, and by the end of 1941, the SS Einsatzgruppen, or action squads, had killed 1.4 million Jews and Slavs. And the Einsatzgruppen was what was used prior to the larger concentration camps, the larger death camps being set up. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, the final solution was put into place. So it was the final solution to the quote unquote Jewish question. And that is when we see the production of death camps. Concentration camps were part of this, but they had been used prior to this time period in Germany. Death camps were typically not in Germany. So these included the creation of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Kumenhof, and Belzec. And 5.7 million Jews and 1 million others were killed in these death camps. Jews did resist this, but again, it was very difficult to resist in any sort of collective way. This really The German policy of collective punishment really hampered this, but there were ghetto uprisings. That's what this is here. This is in Warsaw. So prior to being shipped off to concentration camps, Jews were typically taken by train to different ghettos within places like Poland and Eastern Germany. And then from there, they were shipped off again to death camps. So this Warsaw ghetto uprising happens in the spring of 1943. But then the ghetto was burned by the Nazis and destroyed. These are real cattle cars where that Jews were taken to concentration camps in. And these are major concentration camps, extermination camps, and euthanasia operations. And we will get into this more in class. But one thing I'd like to point out is that they're all pretty much towards the east. So the people who were liberating these camps were generally actually troops from the USSR. These are pictures that you've seen probably in US history as well, but the conditions in these camps were horrible. People were starved to death, and if not to death, they were starved nearly to death, not to mention all the diseases that ran rampant within the camps, and no one was safe, women, men, children. It was truly horrific. And that, along with the bombing, is where you see the extreme amount of deaths here. So just to cover this, so this is Jewish deaths is around 6 million. The United States, 0.3 million. The British, zero point 0.4 million. Um, then Polish people, so not Jews, but Poles. So these were considered to be Slavs, and this is, thank you, the first episode of Lightning War. That's 6 million. Japan, 2 million. 4 million in Germany, and 15 million in China. 20 million in the USSR. And this gets back to who was doing the bulk of the fighting. These are questions to ask yourself. So, who is fighting? Who is invaded? The USSR fought for 3 years without the United States or the British in Europe. So, these bombing campaigns were very, very deadly. And that is where we will finish this part of the PowerPoint on that terrifying note.